Welcome to this YSL tutorial. In this video we're going to cover DDL or Data Definition Language triggers in Microsoft SQL Server. We'll begin the video with an explanation of what triggers actually are and how DDL triggers fit into the bigger picture of triggers in SQL Server. Then we'll talk about some of the main data definition events you might be interested in attaching your triggers to, and where you can go to find a complete list of the data definition events. We'll take you through how to write code to create DDL triggers and also how to modify and delete them later. We'll also have an explanation of DDL trigger scope, which is basically down to whether you want your triggers to work on a single database or across an entire server. The last thing we'll cover in the video is how you can change the firing order of your triggers, so how you can choose the first and the last trigger that fire for a particular event. So let's get started. In SQL Server, a trigger is a special kind of stored procedure, which is executed in response to certain events in a database. They come in three main forms. These are DML, or Data Manipulation Language triggers, DDL, or Data Definition Language, and finally there are logon triggers as well. In this video, we're going to focus on DDL triggers, and as I've already mentioned, DDL stands for Data Definition Language. Basically, this is anything which modifies the objects in a database, so it basically corresponds to three main keywords in SQL Server: create, alter, and drop. There are several other keywords, but these are the main focus for this video. You can create a DDL trigger so that it fires only in response to events on a single database, or you can make it so that the DDL trigger fires in response to events across an entire server. We're going to begin this video with a quick look at how to create a simple DDL trigger attached to the create table event in a database. Before you create a DDL trigger, you need to decide whether it will be scoped to a single database or to the entire server, and the method that you use to create your trigger can depend on that choice. If you're creating a database scoped trigger, one way to create it is to expand the databases folder, then the database you want to attach the trigger to, then the programmability folder, and finally within there, find the database triggers folder. You can right-click on that folder and choose to create a new database trigger, and that will create some system generator code that you can modify to create your trigger. We're not going to do it that way, we're actually going to write the code out from scratch shortly. But before we do that, let's find out where you can store your server scoped triggers. If I collapse all of these folders, to find a server scoped trigger, you need to expand the server objects folder. Within there, you'll find a triggers folder. Unfortunately, you can't right-click and create a new server scoped trigger using a menu option. So if you want a server scoped trigger, you have to write the code from scratch. We're going to do that to create a new trigger that's attached to our movies database, and it's going to handle the create table event. To create a new DDL trigger scoped to a database, you'll need a new query window, and at the top of this I'm going to write a quick use statement to make sure we're working in the correct database, use movies, go to make sure that the next statement is the first in the batch, and then the statement to create a trigger, which is literally create trigger. Following that, you give your trigger a sensible name. Mine's going to be called TRG, no new tables. Hopefully that gives you a clue about what my trigger will do. Following the name of your trigger, you say what the trigger is scoped to. So I'm going to say on database, which means that my trigger will only respond to events in the database that the trigger is being created in. Later on we'll talk about how you can extend that scope to the entire server. Following the scope, you say which event or events your trigger will handle. And you do that with the word for, and then you need to list the event names that you want your trigger to handle. There's an awful lot of events that a DDL trigger can handle. The best way to find the entire list is with a quick Google for DDL events, which should return fairly close to the top of the page, the DDL events list on the Microsoft Developer Network site. And in there, what you will hopefully find is a great big long list of all of the DDL events. The one that we're going to use today in this quick example is called create table, and there it is. So I can scope my DDL trigger to the create table event. So back to my code. What I literally have to write is create underscore table, and that trigger will only work for the create table event in the movies database. Next I have to say what I want my trigger to do. I'm going to write the word as, and then optionally a begin and an end block, and within there the instructions that I want my trigger to perform. So I'm going to have a really simple print statement that's going to print a message to the end user. No new tables, please. And following that, I need to make sure that the statement which tries to create the table doesn't carry forward. So I want to roll back the transaction that's being created when somebody tries to create a new table. All I need to do now is execute this code to create my trigger. And there it is, commands completed successfully. And I should now be able to find that trigger within the Object Explorer window in my Movies database, Programmability, and Database Triggers. I'm going to refresh this folder first by right-clicking on it and choosing Refresh. And when I expand the folder, there's my new trigger just created. To test if the trigger works, we'll need to try to create a new table inside the Movies database. And I've got a bit of sample code here that will try to do that. It's an incredibly simple table with a single column called ID. And if I try to execute this code, it's not going to work. We're going to see the error message, or the message that we asked our trigger to display, no new tables please, and then an actual error message explaining that the transaction was ended in the trigger. So the end result is that in the Movies database, we do not end up with a test table. We should also make sure that the trigger doesn't prevent us from creating tables in other databases. So we have a test.db database that currently doesn't contain any tables at all, apart from the system-generated ones. So if I modify my code to, say, use test.db instead of movies, and try to execute this code, we'll find that this does work. So a database scoped trigger, as we've explained, only affects events in the database that your trigger is attached to. If you want to make changes to the way a trigger works, you'll need to write some code to do it, and the easiest thing to do by far is use the code you used to create the trigger in the first place. Find the word create and change that to the word alter, and then you can make any changes to your trigger that you like. I'm going to extend what my trigger does. It's going to handle a couple of extra events. It's going to handle the alter table and the drop table events, as well as the create table. So basically any changes made to my tables at all will be prevented by this trigger. I'll make a quick change to the message that gets printed as well. So it says no changes to tables please. And then if I execute this code, my trigger will be updated. To test if it works, I can go back to my test code where I was creating a new table. So let's modify which database we're using, so it uses the Movies database again. If I execute this code, I'll be told again that I can't create a new table, as I couldn't before, but the message is slightly different this time. It says no changes to tables, please. If I write some code that tries to drop a table as well, so if I say drop table, let's see, one of the tables in this database is DDL cast, and if I try to execute that code, again I'll be told the same message. So that's part of my trigger, no changes to tables please, and I find that my transaction was ended in the trigger. If you want to remove a trigger completely, you can do that in one of two ways. You can either use the Object Explorer, and if you expand the database and the Programmability folder, Database Triggers, you can right-click on the trigger you want to remove and choose to delete it. You'll be presented with a dialog box asking if you want to definitely do that. I'm going to click Cancel in this case, so I can show you how to write the code to do it as well. So I'm going to create a new query window to do this, and I'm going to make sure that I'm using Movies and Go. And to write code to delete a trigger, we write the statement drop trigger, and then trg no new tables, which was the name of my trigger. And we also have to say that it was on the database. So if I execute the code, I'll find that my trigger has now been deleted. If I go back to the Object Explorer, refresh my database triggers folder, I'll find that the trigger is no longer there. Rather than deleting a trigger, you can also choose to temporarily disable it. So if I change my code again so that I recreate my no new tables trigger, I'll change the word alter to the word create and execute that code. I'll be able to find my trigger again in the Object Explorer window. If I refresh my database triggers folder, one way to disable that trigger is actually using the Object Explorer window. If I right-click on the trigger, there's an option there to disable it. If I choose that option, I'll find that I get a little message confirming that that's happened. And if I were to now go and run some sample code to try to perhaps create a new table in the movies database, what I should find is that my trigger is no longer active. So let me just run a quick bit of code that will drop that table again. So drop table TBL test and go. If I execute that, so everything that I want to do to tables I can now do because my trigger has been disabled. If I head back to the Object Explorer window, I can right click on the trigger again and I can choose to enable it again. Again, I'll get us another error message, confirmation message. And now, this time, if I try to execute some code to create my table, I won't be allowed to because my trigger is now enabled again. So that's one way to enable and disable triggers using the Object Explorer window. I can also write code to disable and enable my triggers. So if I create a new query window, make sure that I'm using my movies database again, and go, and go, and then I can write statements that both enable and disable my triggers. So to disable a trigger, I simply write disable trigger, followed by what the name of the trigger is, which was called no new tables, and on database. If I execute that code now, that will disable my triggers. One quick way to prove that to you is if I go back to my Object Explorer, and if I right-click on that trigger, if I refresh the table first and right-click on that trigger, notice that I can't choose to disable it anymore because the trigger is already disabled by running my code. Again, if I wanted to enable a trigger in code, I simply change the word disable to the word enable and execute the code again, and quickly prove to you in the Object Explorer, if I refresh the database triggers folder again, if I right-click on that trigger, I can't enable it anymore because it already is by running that code. A neat little trick you can perform when you're disabling triggers in code is to disable all of the triggers on the database or on the server in one go. So if I change my code again so that I'm disabling a trigger, so disable trigger, rather than using the named trigger, you can replace the name of a trigger with the word all instead. So if I execute that code, I'll find that all of the triggers on the entire database have now been disabled. So if I refresh the database triggers folder again, I'll find that if I try to disable the trigger, I can't because it already is. Re-enabling triggers, as you'd expect, is as straightforward as changing the word disable to the word enable, and if I execute this code again, go back to the Object Explorer, refresh this folder, I'll find that this trigger has now been enabled again. And that will be true for any other triggers on this database. So there we go, a nice little trick for enabling and disabling all triggers. So far all the examples we've created have been scoped to a single database, but it's relatively straightforward to extend that scope to an entire server. Genuinely, all you would have to do is, in the code that creates your trigger, modify the word database and replace it with the words all server. And that's genuinely all that's needed. That will create a trigger that scopes the entire server. If I execute this code now, again, commands completed successfully, to find my trigger in the Object Explorer, I'll have to, well, first of all, I'm going to collapse the databases folder to make it a bit easier to read. And in the server list, look for the server objects folder, and then look for the triggers folder in there. I'll give it a quick refresh to make sure my trigger is going to be in there. And there it is, my server scoped trigger. You can follow this same rule if you want to do anything that we've done so far with any of our database triggers. So if you want to, for instance, let's see, enable triggers on a server, then you can exchange the word database with the words all server. So this little string of code here will enable all the server scope triggers on the server. What else do we have available? We could drop triggers on the server as well as on a database, and again just exchange the word database for the words all server, and executing the code will remove the trigger. And there we go. So we've just seen that it's possible to create two triggers to handle the same set of events, one scoped to the server and one scoped to a database. It's worthwhile quickly mentioning something about the order in which those triggers will fire. Server scope triggers will always fire before any database scope triggers, and there's nothing you can do to affect that. But as we've seen that we can create more than one trigger to handle the same set of events with different scopes, it's also worthwhile mentioning that you can create multiple triggers in the same scope to handle the same set of events. And if you want to affect the order of that set of triggers, there is something that you can do about it. To show you how this works, we're going to create two new triggers on our database, on our movies database. They're incredibly simple triggers. They're going to handle the create table event, and all they're going to do is print a unique message when that event runs. So if I execute this set of code to create these two triggers, head back to my Object Explorer. If I refresh my database triggers folder in the movies database, I'll have those two new triggers. I also want to disable the no new tables trigger as well. I don't want that one to be running, otherwise that's going to interfere with what I'm about to show you. So if I disable the no new tables trigger, and there it is, what I should find now is that if I try to create a new table in this database, then I'm going to get two separate messages, but I'm not entirely sure which order those messages will appear, because I'm not sure which order my two triggers will fire in. So if I execute this code here to create, again, my simple test table in the movies database, I actually get my triggers in the order in which they've been created. So I've got the second trigger message appearing first, and the first trigger message appearing second. And what I'd like to do is I'd like to change the order that those two things happen in. I'd like to make sure that the first trigger does run first. To change the order in which your triggers fire on either a database or a server, you can use the cleverly named system store procedure called setTriggerOrder. So let's have a quick look at how that works. If I create a new query window, and I want to make sure that I'm using my movies database, and go, and then I'm going to execute, or exec, a system store procedure called sp underscore set trigger order, and there it is. Now there are four different parameters for this store procedure. The first parameter is the name of the trigger whose order you want to set. So as you can see in the tooltip here, as I'm listing out my parameters, it says @triggerName. Then the second parameter is the order that you want the trigger to run in. The third parameter is the statement type that the trigger handles. And finally, there's a parameter called namespace. So that's essentially whether it's scoped to the database or the server. So if I fill in these parameters quickly, the trigger name here is equal to trg first trigger. So I'm going to set this one to be the first trigger. The second parameter is the order, so the order equals first. The third parameter is the statement type, so @stmt type, so I want to type in, that's going to be equal to create table. Now, for the statement type parameter, you can only specify one single statement at a time. So if my trigger handled create table, alter table, and drop table, I'd have to execute this store procedure separately for each one of those events. And then finally, I'll set the @namespace parameter, and @namespace, sorry, let's spell that with a lowercase n, @namespace is equal to database. One quick note, if you were doing this for the server, you wouldn't say, in place of database, you wouldn't say all server to extend the scope. In this case, you would just say the word server. So that's how you change that. But my trigger is scoped to the database, so I want to make sure that I have that word in there. So, executing this this code now will change the order of my triggers so that first trigger is the first one. If I execute that, I can see that it's successfully completed. Then if I head back to my test code, which is going to try to create a new table, I'll need to delete it first. Let me execute that code first to make sure that my test table has disappeared. And if I execute this code again now, this time I see that the first trigger is the first one that's fired. Just to finish off this little section, it's worth mentioning that you can also change a trigger to be the last one that's fired. So if I go back to my code, which was changing the order of my triggers, the other available options for the @order parameter, as well as first, we can say last, and that will set this trigger to be the last one. If I execute this code again, and then head back to my test code, delete my test table again, and then try to create it again, you can see that the first trigger now runs last. Finally, as well as saying first and last, if you just wanted to clear the ordering for a particular trigger, you can actually set the order back to none. So if I execute this code again now, and again head back to the test code, delete my table, and then recreate it, I'll see that again my first trigger comes in last, or is fired last, and that's again back to the original order that my triggers were created in. So there we go, there's a quick example of how you can change the orders of your triggers. hopefully it doesn't need to be mentioned, but I'm going to anyway, that you can only have one first and one last trigger. The remaining triggers you have handling a particular event will run in the order in which you've created them. If you've enjoyed this training video, you can find many more online training resources at www.wiseowl.co.uk.